Before I present our speaker today, I want to make a quick plug for next week's presentation, so you all come back on Wednesday, February 5th. Sarah Greenleaf, urban forester with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, Greening the Gateway Cities program, will present a lecture on urban rewilding. Today's presentation, titled What is Rewilding, will be given by Dr. Reed Noss, who is a writer, photographer, lecturer, and consultant in natural history, ecology, and conservation, and serves as Chief Science Advisor for the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative and the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance. He was formerly Provost Distinguished Research Professor of Biology at the University of Central Florida. He served as Editor-in-Chief of Conservation Biology, Science Editor for Wild Earth magazine, and President of the Society for Conservation Biology. He is an elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Thank you so much for joining us today from Florida. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to talk about rewilding, general talk, which I define as restoration and recovery of wildness. At the bottom here, my affiliation, just to update that a little bit, I actually work now half-time for University of Florida, Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, and also half-time for the Southeastern Grasslands Institute. So again, I prefer a simple definition, especially when communicating quickly, like in an elevator talk to somebody about what rewilding is. It's basically restoring and recovering wildness. In the article that many of you read by Michael Soule and myself back in 1998, we defined it as the scientific argument for restoring big wilderness based on the regulatory role of large predators. So it was very carnivore focused, as we'll see. I'll talk more about this. A year later, Michael Soule already opened it up a little more to other interpretations, a science-based restoration of self-regulating ecosystems, that's a critical point, and a transformation in the human-nature relationship. And then finally, a recent article that Michael Soule actually was posthumously an author on, and I was also an author. There were about 20 some authors, Principles of Rewilding, Carver et al. You can read what it is here, but it's a process of rebuilding following human disturbance a natural ecosystem by restoring natural process, food web, etc. So the history, it's a little interesting. It's quite interesting, actually, because it came from two very different foundational bases. One was the science of ecology, the academic science of ecology in the early 20th century. And then later on in the 20th century, it also arose within the grassroots wilderness preservation movement, sometimes known as the radical environmental movement, beginning around 1980. And they converged at some point, as I will note. The academic argument was based on a goal of representing intact examples of all major ecosystems in protected areas for their scientific value, so we could study them and learn about them. And in cases where no intact examples of an ecosystem remained, for instance, the tallgrass prairie, well, those ecosystems would have to be restored. So that's a kind of rewilding. The grassroots wilderness advocates, on the other hand, were very focused on wilderness and on recovering wilderness in areas where it had been lost to various kinds of development. And so this term, wilderness recovery, was the original term for rewilding. It was later abbreviated to rewilding. The idea of wilderness recovery then was to recreate wilderness, identify key areas, close roads, remove developments, and reintroduce wildlife that had been extirpated, especially the large carnivores. So from the academic end, the father of this idea of rewilding was Victor Shelford. At his time, a very well-known ecologist. He was among the founders of the Ecological Society of America, which is the leading professional community of ecologists. And he also had a committee within the Ecological Society focused on representing all ecosystem types in protected areas. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, in cases where those ecosystem types no longer existed as intact examples, he stated there needs to be restoration of the primitive as well as protection of the primitive. And he wrote this all the way back in 1931. So this idea goes back a ways. Now, from the wilderness activist side, the so-called radical environmentalist side, the leader of this idea was Dave Foreman, who just died, well, 3 years ago now. Dave was the co-founder and the primary leader of a radical group known as Earth First. Probably some of you heard of it. And then later, Michael Soule and I and Dave and a few others founded the Wildlands Project, and then later the Rewilding Institute. But Dave's idea, which he wrote in an article in a magazine called The Progressive, pick an area for each of our major ecosystems and recreate the American wilderness, not in little pieces, but in chunks of 1 million or 10 million acres. So he was saying it's not enough, for example, to say no more dams on our wild rivers. We need to start tearing down some of the dams already built. And as you can imagine, this was a very radical idea, but now dam removal is well accepted as a way to restore watersheds and restore populations of depleted aquatic species. And salmon in particular, a number of dams have been decommissioned and torn down for salmon in the Pacific Northwest, as an example. So wilderness recovery areas then. This idea was introduced in an editorial in the Earth First Journal in 1983 by Howie Wolk, who was one of the co-founders of Earth First. And then specific wilderness recovery networks were designed for a number of different regions around North America. And around 1989, Dave Foreman began using the term rewilding as a synonym for wilderness recovery. And the term rewilding first appeared in an article in Newsweek about Earth First and their desire to protect or restore about a third of the North American continent. Again, at the time, and this isn't that long ago after all, at the time that was thought to be extremely radical, impossible, impractical. But today, more than 3 decades later, we have an internationally accepted goal of protecting 30% of the Earth's land and water area by the year 2030. That's under the Convention on Biological Diversity, United Nations Global Biodiversity Framework. So it's a general theme here I want to mention, I think, for those of you interested in the environment. So many times, ideas that started out on the fringe, that were thought to be totally impossible, impractical, way out there, they finally become part of the mainstream if you wait long enough. So it's very encouraging. It might take a few decades or more, but it can happen. So the first wilderness recovery network, to my knowledge, was one that I designed for Southern Ohio. This is a kind of a crude cartoon I made of this. I actually did this work when I worked for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. My boss gave me an interesting assignment. He said, Reed, figure out what we're missing in Ohio. What aren't we doing? What aren't we covering in our conservation plans? And so I came up with this design. My boss loved it, but the higher ups hated it. You know, we've been paying your salary for 6 months to come up with this nonsense. So I actually quit my job over that. But the idea was to take existing conservation areas, buffer them with relatively low intensity land use, and connect those core areas, the reserves, by corridors. Now a very well accepted idea. It wasn't so well accepted in 1982. When I quit my job in Ohio, I moved to Florida, and I started working on a similar proposal for the state of Florida. Focused on wilderness recovery again, what we now call rewilding. And the species that I used to help design this network, this wilderness recovery network in Florida, were the Florida panther and the Florida black bear, because those are the most area demanding, wilderness demanding species. And so this is what the map looked like. Again, this is a kind of a cartoon. It's an artist's conception of a big wall-sized map with overlays that we put on it, Mylar overlays with colored pens. But it comprised about half of the state of Florida. It was considered totally impractical at the time. And the corridor idea was entirely forgotten for at least 10 years. But gradually it came back. And most recently, in 2021, the Florida legislature unanimously passed a bipartisan bill, the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act, to protect about half of the state of Florida in basically core areas, core reserves, and surrounding lands used for multiple uses, especially rangelands, cattle grazing areas. And this is called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And they're putting in right now about $500 million a year to protect these lands. And the state has actually been spending that much on conservation planning altogether, including the counties, for quite a while. The first article then on rewilding by that name, many of you have read already. It's part of your assignment. But Michael Sully and I decided it was time to actually write an article on this. We've been talking about it for 10 years after Dave Foreman introduced the term. So we published the article. And again, we defined rewilding in terms of the 3 C's: cores, these are core areas, corridors, and carnivores. So again, very carnivore or big predator focused at the beginning. But over the years, we began to see that, wildness exists across a whole spectrum of land uses. You can have wildness in urban areas. And I understand from the announcement that you're having a lecture on urban rewilding just next week. But in any city, you have usually city parks, you have some vacant lots. Go out in the country, there's wood lots remaining even in intensive cropland. But these are small patches, they're not complete food webs. There's quite a bit of human impact, and there's a lot of novel ecosystems that didn't exist naturally, but have been created more or less by humans, either intentionally or unintentionally. But you move across the spectrum, the small natural areas and moderate-sized natural areas in dominated matrix, into larger multiple use lands like our national forests, for example. And finally, at the wildest end, we have wilderness areas and national parks, large areas with complete or near complete food webs, minimal human impact. And importantly, they're largely self-managing. You don't have to spend a lot of time managing them because they're essentially autonomous. They take care of themselves. And so the focal species, the ones you focus on to help you design a network, a rewilding network, would differ with the context. So in the more urban end, you can focus on plants, certain birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects such as butterflies. In the middle part of the spectrum, you have some medium to large carnivores, coyotes, for example, ungulates, maybe elk, or at least deer. And you have birds that do require some minimum area-sensitive birds. But at the bigger end, we have our large carnivores again and our migratory ungulates. And so wilderness then is the foundational idea for the wilder end of the rewilding or wildness spectrum. And we have in the United States and many other countries now, a national system of designated wilderness areas that were created under the Wilderness Act of 1964. Now that act took about 40 years to pass. Work on that act actually started back in the 1920s. But wilderness throughout this time was basically considered self-willed land, again, autonomous land. And the definition that was given in the legislation said a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled. That basically means uncontrolled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Now, we may not use that language today. This would be somewhat politically incorrect today to use this same kind of language. But in the 60s, this adequately expressed what people thought of as wilderness. But again, the wilderness idea goes back much further. One of the most famous names in the whole field of conservation is Aldo Leopold, who basically is the father of wildlife management, the whole field of wildlife management. And way back in 1922, he proposed that a large portion of the Gila National Forest in New Mexico be managed as wilderness. And that was designated in 1924, before there was a National Wilderness Act, as the nation's first designated wilderness area. And Leopold back then defined wilderness in recreational terms. An area that's open to lawful hunting and fishing, big enough to absorb a 2 weeks pack trip, and devoid of roads, artificial trails, cottages, or other works of man. Now, later in his career, in fact, just about 10 years later, he started to emphasize the ecological values of wilderness. So this concept of ecological wilderness emerged, mostly self-managing ecosystems, as I mentioned before, with complete food webs and natural disturbance regimes. So this photo I took in the Grand Teton National Park. I was watching this herd of wild bison, and nearby a group of I and some other biologists were looking through spotting scopes at a wolf pack around their den. And there were baby wolves playing and rolling around, wrestling. It was just a magnificent thing. And wolves don't need complete wilderness, but they need wildness. Same thing with our large migratory ungulates, like the American pronghorn. They need conservation on a regional scale. The pronghorn, for example, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which includes the Grand Tetons, by the way, they migrate each year up to 550 kilometers. That's 341 miles round trip from their wintering areas in low elevations to their summer areas higher, mostly in the national park. So they need a lot of well-connected wild space. So again, these large areas are necessary for big animals that have large home ranges, and especially if you have animals that require several distinct habitat types to meet their life history needs. For example, in Florida, our black bears shift habitat use seasonally from pine flatwoods in the winter and spring to oak scrub in the summer and fall. And this is largely due to seasonal shifts in the availability of food. For example, in the fall, abundant acorns are available for them to eat. And some natural disturbance regime, for example, fires in boreal forests, operate at million-acre scales and exhibit shifting mosaics of recovery stages after the disturbance. So we call these patch dynamics, and these need room to operate. Some of those boreal fires, by the way, can cover several million acres. A single fire event can cover millions of acres. It's incredible to think about. Because these large animals and large disturbance regimes are vulnerable to fragmentation at the scale of millions of acres, they help us determine the necessary size and configuration of regional protected area networks. So for example, Yellowstone to Yukon. I'm also proud to be a co-founder of Yellowstone to Yukon. It was modeled and inspired directly by the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Yellowstone to Yukon began in 1991. But here we have an area from the vicinity of Yellowstone National Park in the south, all the way up to the Yukon, as the word states, in the north. And the grizzly bear and the wolf are the main focal species. And what's interesting here is that a lot of area within wide does need rewilding, but some of it is already wild. So it's more of a task of keeping it wild. It doesn't need rewilding, just keeping it wild. So these large animals and big disturbance regimes have a number of different roles. Studies have shown that if you remove top predators and large herbivores, there are changes in the ecosystem. They're less resilient to climate change. They're less resistant to biological invasions by non-native species. Tremendous literature has built up on this since the 1960s. And it makes a lot of sense. It's really not that hard. Here's a very recent paper that came out, basically habitat suitability of the puma, cougar, mountain lion, panther. That's all the same species, by the way. And you notice the highest suitability here is in blue, and that's mostly in Eastern North America. We think of the mountain lion as a Western species, but actually it has more suitable habitat in the East. And so even right today, with our present habitat configuration, we could get a lot of these animals back. Bison are being reintroduced to a lot of areas in the East. This is a large area within the so-called land between the lakes conservation area in Tennessee and Kentucky. It's fenced off and has a herd of bison and also a herd of elk roaming freely within this large area. And studies have shown that these animals have played very important roles in their ecosystem, especially bison. They rewild and restore their range a lot better than cattle. Natural disturbances, fire is in the news a lot for good reason. Fire is destructive today largely because of decades and decades of fire suppression, where we've put out fires, we've kept fires from coming in. And so fuels have built up, so when we have a fire, it's very destructive. But fire is essential as a natural disturbance agent that helps rejuvenate ecosystems. And we have a few places where we can let fires burn. Yellowstone National Park. Here's an example. This photo is taken from the space station in 2009. A fire, it consumed, this was a fairly small fire. It only consumed about 10,000 acres, and it burned out naturally with a change in the weather, which is what fires normally do. But even in the east, this is a photo from Everglades National Park. This is a fire that was in the western part of the park, far from Miami or other urban areas. And the park managers just left it to burn. It was a lightning ignited fire, like most natural fires are in North America. And when you can leave these to burn, they do marvelous things with regenerating vegetation and creating these mosaics of different stages that species need. And then, of course, wilderness is good for people. John Muir noticed this. Thousands of tired, over-civilized people found out that going back to the mountains, as he put it, is going home, that wilderness is a necessity. Now, the concept of wildness, again, rewilding is a little more general term than wilderness, and so it's the same for wildness. Henry David Thoreau pointed out that in wildness is the preservation of the world. Now, where did he find wildness? Primarily in Walden Pond. That's where he wrote a series of essays in the book called Walden. And maybe some of you have been there, being in Massachusetts. Walden Pond is just 1.4 miles from the center of Concord, Massachusetts. So Henry would go home on the weekends or whenever, do his laundry, or his mom would do his laundry. He'd stock up on food and go back to his cottage on Walden Pond. So a lot of people have kind of belittled him for that, but why not? Look what he found there. Look what he sought and look what he found. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." So even these small, semi-natural, wild, but not wilderness areas can be tremendous teachers. The last place I lived up until just a few years ago, I had a place near my home that was my personal Walden, and it just so happened that it was also 1.4 miles from my home. It wasn't wilderness by any stretch of the imagination, but it brought me a lot of comfort, a lot of solace, and it was connected to a whole series of other areas. If you follow Mills Creek down, it empties into a river called the Econ-Lockhatchee. This is a scene along the Econ-Lockhatchee. It's a huge landscape. Ultimately, it's millions of acres of connected land that's part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It's not wilderness, but it's wild. And there's large predators. There's the occasional panther, and there's lots of big alligators coexisting with people. And even in these less than wilderness landscapes, we have lots of species that are sensitive to human activity, that people will kill them if they get a chance, like venomous snakes, like this beautiful copperhead. They need wild areas to seek refuge from people so they can survive. So finally, I'm going to turn a little bit to Europe. Now, Europe, is obviously pretty heavily populated, pretty heavily developed, and you wouldn't think that you would have much of an opportunity for rewilding there. And indeed, in Europe, rewilding has been largely focused on low-intensity agricultural landscapes, but also on the de-domestication of livestock, which I think is a really cool idea. Encouraging livestock to basically get back some of the traits of their extinct ancestors, like the aurochs in the case of domestic cattle. The direct ancestor of domestic cattle was this huge beast you see here. And if we can get domestic cattle to behave more like aurochs, become undomesticated, we might bring back that important role in the ecosystem. But it's not just the cattle and wild horses that are being rewilded. Wolves are making a comeback in much of Europe. So we see here in the greens and also the blue, which is undefined, which they don't know if they're permanent or sporadic. But this is all areas that are being actively used by wolves in Europe today. Same thing for lynx. It's a somewhat tenuous existence for lynx. They were reintroduced to several parts of Europe starting a couple decades ago. And now you see in green areas where they're doing okay. And the same thing for brown bear. This is the same species, different subspecies as our grizzly bear. They're making a comeback across much of Europe. Now, not without controversy, I should say, but most people are willing to let these big animals live and come back. Now, a personal story, I just got back from a trip to Austria and Germany with my family. We made a hike in a national park called National Park Berchtesgaden, which is part of the Bavarian Alps. There's a little finger of Germany that actually sticks into Austria. And we were following this trail of blood. It was pretty grotesque in some ways. My 5-year-old granddaughter was absolutely terrified, whereas my 13-year-old granddaughter thought it was really cool. But we followed this trail of blood, and it was obviously not a clean kill. It took a long time for this poor animal to die. We finally found the carcass you see on the lower left of a red deer killed by a brown bear. You can see some of the tracks were still around. It wasn't a very clean kill, as I said. I think this was probably an inexperienced young bear, not very good at killing deer, but still playing a very important role in the system, because deer without predators will overpopulate and damage vegetation. But there are challenges to rewilding. I mean, blood is kind of a scary, gross thing to a lot of people. And so big predators are scary. But we can resolve some of these challenges. We need to think about coexistence, learning how to get along with each other again. And sometimes rewilding is not the best word to use, because to a lot of people, it conjures images of human-wildlife conflicts, like large carnivores killing livestock, pets, or occasionally people. A study in Nepal recently found that rural people found the rewilding term unnerving, a little bit scary, but they welcomed this idea of forest regeneration, which was basically the same thing. One of the big challenges to rewilding is roads, because roads directly kill wildlife, and they also serve as barriers that prevent wildlife from moving across the landscape. But these challenges can be overcome, or at least minimized, by intelligently designed wildlife crossing structures, like you see here on the right, and associated barriers, fences that channel wildlife into the crossing so they don't cross the road. So that's one of the biggest things we have to deal with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We have wildlife crossings throughout Florida now to try to encourage this. The one on the right here is actually in Germany. The Europeans were ahead of us on wildlife crossings at this scale anyway. So future of rewilding, human population growth obviously makes rewilding a little more difficult to achieve, but many countries, many developed countries are actually losing population. And that actually makes rewilding easier. But it also is problematic because when people concentrate in cities, they're more removed from nature, at least traditionally. So again, rewilding urban areas, urban landscapes is a critical thing to teach coexistence, harmony, and intimacy between humans and nature. To do that, we have to have contact and familiarity. However, the original objective of recreating large wilderness areas with complete food webs, including apex predators, that's more important than ever because these opportunities are still quite few. And finally, my final point I wanted to make, you don't hear natural history, the study of nature, associated that much with rewilding, but I think it's a really important thing that's been overlooked. I think the key to appreciating wildness, wild things, and appreciating rewilding is knowing something about nature, studying nature, either as an amateur or a professional. And it's fun. Most people will find natural history inherently interesting, especially if they have a good teacher or a good mentor that shows them how cool it is. And so I look at it this way. At the top here, you spend time in nature, you develop an aesthetic and a visceral appreciation for nature, you develop wonder and curiosity about nature. This leads many of us to develop and seek factual knowledge, for some of us to formally study nature. With that study, we develop increasing respect and affection for natural objects, and we're offended by destruction of nature. And we take action in some ways to reduce this destruction. But that in turn can lead to burnout unless we keep spending more time in nature. And what's cool about it is that you don't need wilderness to appreciate natural history and wildness. We can experience it in our own backyards. So finally, toward the end of her life, in fact, very end of her life, Rachel Carson, who I hope you've heard of, wrote The Silent Spring, but she also wrote this book that was never finished. She died before she finished it, but it was published, The Sense of Wonder. And it basically was about how wonder and fascination with nature, joy and awe are great motivators for becoming more intimate with nature and wildness. And I think we need a lot more of that. And I think the rewilding movement will benefit from people that have these kinds of experiences. Okay, well, I didn't go as long as I thought I might. I hope I didn't speak too fast, but I've left some time for questions.
Thank you. We definitely have some time for questions. I think we'll just sort of open it up. If you want to put a hand up, then we can just make sure we can focus on who has something they'd like to ask. And I always say I always have lots of questions, so give you your chance before I jump in. So I'll throw out the first question. I'm curious, the two large-scale examples that you gave that are currently in progress that are very exciting to hear about. So Yellowstone to Yukon and the Florida Wildlife Corridor. How much are the large carnivores explicitly part of that plan? Are there any plans to reintroduce large carnivores? Are there expectations that with conservation, large carnivores will persist or perhaps come back on their own? And relatedly, is there public discourse about this and concern and any kind of mitigating attempts to deal with concern about that, if that makes sense?
That's a great question. Well, I'll start out with the Florida example because that came a little earlier. The original focus of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, the early version back in the 1980s and early 90s, was very much focused on the Florida panther, which at the time was entirely restricted to extreme South Florida, mostly in the Big Cypress National Preserve and surrounding area. And so the idea was to get the state connected enough with wild habitat that the panther would be able to naturally recolonize its range throughout Florida and beyond. And that's starting to happen. Male panthers disperse a lot further than females, especially young males. In fact, the furthest we know of in the case of Florida panthers was a male, this happened about 5 years ago, that was shot not far from Atlanta, southwest of Atlanta along the Alabama border by a hunter. The hunter turned the carcass in to wildlife authorities. They tested the blood, looked for the DNA, and sure enough, it was from the Big Cypress population of Florida panther. So that's a few hundred miles. So the males, at least, are capable of rewilding across long distances. A mountain lion, again, same species from South Dakota, made it all the way to Connecticut a few years ago. How it did so with all the roads in between, it's hard to imagine, but it did. Now, the Florida panther also has a recovery plan. And in the recovery plan, it calls for at least 3 populations. In order to be delisted under the Endangered Species Act, there have to be at least 3 populations of 240 or more adults each. We don't even have one population that big. The current population of Florida panther is somewhere between about 150 and 200 animals. So we haven't even reached a third of that potential. So there is talk of directly reintroducing panthers into parts of its range, and it has been thwarted by local politics, basically county commissions saying, no, we don't want the panther. On the other hand, people in Florida in general do want the panther back. The panther was selected by school children several decades ago as the state animal. Polls show that, a high percent, like 90% of Floridians want the panther back across the state. It's only these conservative counties with conservative county commissions that are opposed to it. Same thing for black bear. Black bear was not as endangered as the panther, but it was highly fragmented. The efforts to conserve and connect land have already benefited the black bear quite a bit in Florida, where the population has expanded. And they're now, unfortunately, I think, talking about a new hunting season for black bear. I should have mentioned with respect to panther, no females had moved out of South Florida until, for several decades, until just recently. And at least 2 females have produced litters of kittens in South Central Florida. So the panthers are gradually reestablishing their range. And it's, again, I think because of protection of land for the Florida Wildlife Corridor and for some of these wildlife crossings that have somewhat reduced roadkill. Roadkill is still the largest source of mortality. It's still a big problem. Like I mentioned, roads are the biggest impediment, I think, to rewilding carnivores. But it's coming along. If probably the top priority reintroduction site right now is the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge and surrounding area in South Georgia and adjacent Florida. And a poll there recently showed that most of the local people actually support it. So it is possible we'll get some panthers actively reintroduced there. I have been working, I and 2 other authors, on a proposal to nominate the Okefenokee as a World Heritage Site. The first natural World Heritage Site to be nominated for a long time in the United States, actually. The proposal just this week was sent to the Department of Interior, and it's supposed to be signed by the Secretary of Interior, but we don't have a Secretary of Interior right now, unfortunately. But if someone is able to sign, there's an active secretary. This week, it'll go to the IUCN and UNESCO, which is an office of the UN. And hopefully we will have a World Heritage Site for Okefenokee, which will actually increase its recognition as a conservation area and probably improve its chances of having a reintroduced panther population. Now, briefly, Y2Y focuses again on grizzly bear and wolves. And most people in that region of US and Canada also are supportive of restoring populations of these species, which are, again, are already there. It's just they're fragmented by development in some places. So there are conflicts. A lot of the local people, ranchers especially, are very anti-wolf in particular. Wolves are hated more than bears because wolves kill more livestock than bears do. So it is a challenge, but what's happening, like in Florida and with Y2Y, that some of the other values of rewilding are being emphasized. Some of the ecosystem services. For example, you restore large watersheds, you prevent flooding, you help with aquifer recharge. There's lots of other benefits to people from rewilding, aside from their value to large carnivores and migratory ungulates. So more and more, we are focusing on some of these human benefits to try to get more people supportive of these efforts.
That's really good news. Thank you for all those specific examples that give us some hope. Questions before I jump in with more? Who wants to ask a question? Okay, I'm going to keep going. So my next question then is, can you give us a little bit of a sense of how it works to collaborate across political boundaries? So these are large areas, particularly the Y2Y, where you're working across multiple states. So how does that look in terms of on-the-ground coordination to get people from different regions and different states working towards the same goal?
Well, it's been mostly led by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, environmental groups. There's a group called Yellowstone to Yukon Corporation, which is an NGO, which it's an umbrella group. So there's many other like regional, sub-regional NGOs, land trusts, for example, that buy private land or get conservation easements on private land. A conservation easement, by the way, is an agreement with the landowner where they relinquish some of their rights to develop that land. They maybe said, okay, you can build one house, but you have to leave the rest of it in its current condition, as an example. And the easements can be either purchased by a land trust or by a government, or they can be donated. In the United States, if you donate a conservation easement, you get a fairly significant tax break on your federal income tax, for example. So that's another mechanism. But as far as the cross-boundary coordination, it hasn't really been that challenging because it's been led by some very competent people in these NGOs. And again, there's a whole suite of smaller NGOs that are associated with the Y2Y movement. So it's basically just been a lot of collaboration and cooperation.
All right, so I've got one more question, and then if not, I guess we'll be wrapping up. So my last question is, these are both large-scale, inspiring, exciting projects that you talked about. Are there any other sort of on the horizon, or maybe at smaller scales or less developed that we could hear about in terms of some of these larger rewilding efforts?
Yeah, I mean, the ones I mentioned are two that are furthest along, and had the most successes. There's many others. There's an Eastern Wildways, which is led by the Wildlands Network, which is the new name for the Wildlands Project, which I mentioned that Michael Soule and Dave Foreman and I and several others co-founded back in 1991. But that was meant to be continental in scope. And so there's an Eastern Wildway that the Wildlands Network people have designed, which takes the Florida Wildlife Corridor and extends that kind of mapping all the way to Maine. So parts of Massachusetts are in it, for example. So you can get on the website of the Wildlands Network and look up the Eastern Wildway. And I haven't looked at it recently, but hopefully there's still some information about that. There's also a spine of the continent, which is basically the Rocky Mountains. It's Y2Y plus. So it's going from Y2Y, then all the way south of Yellowstone, all the way into Mexico. And that has been mapped, and parts of it are being implemented, by local environmental conservation groups. There's some smaller areas. There's a proposal. I don't think it's gone too far lately, but it dates back to the 90s. Adirondacks to Algonquin, which goes from the Adirondack Mountains in northern New York State, crosses the St. Lawrence Seaway, and up to Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, with the wolf as the main focal species. Wolves do cross the St. Lawrence River, unfortunately, not as regularly now with global warming because it's not frozen over very often anymore. So they can swim, but they don't like to swim that far. So that's a problem. But that received some effort, of land protection a while back, but I don't think recently it has. Otherwise, that Ohio example I gave. So that was when I first proposed it. Again, it was not all accepted by the state of Ohio, Department of Natural Resources. However, the chapter of the Nature Conservancy in Ohio liked it, and they started buying land in particular to expand their reserve system, because I emphasized that the highest priority was part of that network around, I don't want to try to find the slide, but there's a part of the network in the south near the Ohio River where Nature Conservancy already had a preserve system. It was not completely connected yet. They called it the edge of Appalachia because it's right on the edge of the Appalachian Escarpment or the Allegheny Escarpment. And there's a nearby state forest, nearby meaning about, 25, 30 miles, that was not at all connected. They have now secured a connection between their edge of Appalachian preserves, between those preserves themselves, and to the Shawnee State Forest, which is the state forest. And they send me updates from time to time with maps, and they've invited me to come speak at their meetings. So it's pretty cool. The state government didn't like it, but the Nature Conservancy thought it was a great idea. So they are slowly pursuing it. I mean, these things take time. That was 1982. I made that proposal, and it's, and it started to take shape slowly, and now it's becoming more complete. So we can only hope it'll continue. But there's other efforts of about that size around the country that local conservation groups are spearheading, that are fairly small, but are still in the big picture very significant when you put them all together collectively.
Well, I want to thank you very much for sharing the sort of background history on the idea of rewilding. It's a really great place to start a series off with, and just really a lot of hope as to what is currently going on, and that there's a lot of potential for some of these ideas that were articulated back in the 90s to be taking shape. So I think it's great to have something to be positive about. So I appreciate that. Appreciate you spending the time with us, and thanks all of you for coming. I hope you'll come back next week, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to have you back again in person, or perhaps in some other form in the future. So thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, sir.